Okay, well, welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Modern History Research Seminar this academic year. Thank you very much for attending. My name is Chris Aldous and I'm co-convening the centre with Graciela this year. Now, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Graciela Iglesias-Rogers to you. She's been a colleague of mine since 2014. And her interests are pretty broad: the political, cultural and social history of Europe and Britain, the Americas, Africa and Asia from a transnational perspective, with particular attention to developments relating to Spanish-speaking communities from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And her role is senior lecturer in modern European and global Hispanic history here at the University of Winchester. Now, what's really exciting is that Graciela won a large grant to set up, she won this from the AHRC, to set up an international research network. And this was focused on a concept that she herself came up with, the Hispanic-Anglosphere, transnational networks, global communities, late 18th to early 20th centuries. And she's done this in partnership with the National Trust property Tyntesfield, which is near Bristol, I think. Yes, I'll be talking about that. And it's generated a book, which is, I think, her third book, actually, published this book on the Hispanic-Anglosphere, published in 2021. And this talk today, I guess, is one of the byproducts of her network based on this this work on the Hispanic-Anglosphere. So, without any more delay, I'll hand you over to Graciela and we'll go from there.
Yes. Hello again, back again. And let's see if I can now show the presentation. And hope you are getting it. And just a little message to say, try to turn off your camera, mute your microphone while we are having the presentation. And there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, both verbally, but perhaps even easier for you at home to write it in the chat, because of course we are going to give priority to people who are here in Winchester. And as Chris said, I've been working and researching for this book, the Hispanic-Anglosphere from the 18th to the 20th century. And for those who are here, I'm showing now a copy. And this was part of this project that was funded by the AHRC, and is consisted of establishing an international research network of experts and non-experts that are interested in the relations between the Hispanic and the Anglo world, particularly the world of the British Isles. And particularly, our partnership with National Trust Tyntesfield was because I was particularly interested in researching the so-called richest commoner in the 19th century England. And this commoner was William Gibbs. And particularly doing that encouraged me to check the validity of a number of assertions. And the main assertion regarding this family, the Gibbs family, and William Gibbs in particularly, was that they made their fortune, to say it crudely, and it was said crudely in the 19th century by the Victorian press, that they made their fortune by selling turds of foreign birds, mainly by the trade of guano, which is a fertilizer that comes from the turds of foreign birds. And this was in reference to the signing with the government of Peru of a series of contracts that granted to the Gibbs family exclusive rights to import guano to the UK for many years, and then that was expanded to most of the European continent too. But trying to check the validity of this assertion, I discovered that actually William, with his brother George Henry Gibbs, had transformed the family company, Antony Gibbs Sons, into a commercial powerhouse with permanent agents in Europe and the Americas long before the signing of those contracts, and also long before acquiring Tyntesfield in 1843. So the idea that William bought Tyntesfield because he had the money from the third of the foreign birds is not accurate. They have been rich for many decades, and actually one only added to an existing fortune. And why I'm interested also in Antony Gibbs and Sons, because Antony Gibbs and Sons was the foundation stone of HSBC, or the bank HSBC. So, and you can see how HSBC to this day is very much a global bank and makes very much of its tradition of global entrepreneurship. So, in this talk, because you will see that in the chapter that is in this book, I cover many aspects, because one of the things that I wanted to do with this project was also to highlight the fact that entrepreneurship is not just shaped by facts recorded in balance sheets and by high politics, but sometimes by things like feelings, love, for example, prejudice, and pandemics. Today, I'm going to be talking just about pandemics, okay? And to understand how pandemics shape entrepreneurship, we have to look into the story of Antony Gibbs and Co. And in order to look at the story of Antony Gibbs and Co., we need to start to look to the story of the man who gave the name to the company, who was Antony Gibbs, who was the father of William Gibbs. Antony Gibbs was the sixth in the family of 5 sons and 6 daughters of George Abraham Gibbs, who was a surgeon at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital, and his wife, Anne Vicary. And he went to a grammar school in Exeter, but soon he was apprenticed for 5 years to a Mr. Brooke, who was a merchant in the Spanish trade, and who has been reputed to have taught Antony the rudiments of the Castilian language. His first trading venture was in 1788 as a woolen exporter, principally to Spain and also to Italy. He was also briefly involved with a woolen cloth factory near Exeter. And he was delving into manufacturing and in the process of industrialization that got him into trouble. In 1787, 1788, he suffered serious financial difficulties, lost not only his own money, but some of his families and friends as well. And he tried to resolve the situation by looking for business in the continent. First to France, but sadly he discovered that France was subsumed in the situation that eventually will result in the French Revolution. So eventually he went to Spain, where he did find opportunities, and very good opportunities. Things went really very well. And the first step in his financial recovery involved setting up an agency business in Madrid to serve English manufacturers. Some of the clients were his creditors, including high in the list his brother George Gibbs, who was a merchant in Bristol, who, aware that his debts in Britain were so enormous that none of his assets could be big enough to match them in the short term, decided to turn Antony's debts into loans to his company at high interest rates. As a result, during the rest of Antony's life, and even after that, he and his sons drew a salary from the business, while the rest of the profits tended to be used to pay what the family identify in the ledgers under the code DS, Deudas Sagradas, Sacred Debts. In August 1789, so a month after the French Revolution, Antony sailed to Coruña in the north of Spain and traveled overland to Madrid with his wife, Dorothea Barnetta, who was the daughter of a wealthy Yorkshire wine merchant. And they also carried two young children, George Henry and Harriet, a cousin who acted as a nurse, and Dorothea's personal assistants, and a maid. And the trip was really exhausting, terribly exhausting journey. And Dorothea was already suffering ill health. And you will see in the book, I explain the situation that her mother was particularly anti-Catholic and had already made her predisposed to not like the Spaniards in general. Keep this in mind because family accounts have always stated that William Gibbs was born on 22 May 1790 at 6 Calle de Cantarranas, a residence located a few minutes walk from del Parque de Retiro and the Royal Palace in Madrid, in what today is known as the Calle de Lope de Vega, which is a very good affluent area. But material that I managed to rediscover at the London Metropolitan Archives tells a slightly different and in many ways far more interesting story. William Gibbs was indeed born in Madrid, but probably, surely actually, in a modest flat within a tenement located in Calle de la Reina. So it's at walking distance, but it's a different sort of neighborhood. And that neighborhood today, we know it as the neighborhood of Justice due to the presence of several magistrate court buildings. It was not the roughest of the areas, but the accommodation was cramped for 6 people. And Dorothea had been reared for polite society and suddenly found herself having to share tasks with the maid, not just tasks, but even the space with the maid. But importantly, a receipt that I managed to find, drawn by the owner of the house in the Calle de Cantarranas, explains why is it that they were not there yet, why they were still, and you are going to see why I say still, in the other address. And here, I'm not sure if at home you can read it, but I translated the receipt. And the important thing to notice here is that the date of the contract that they had signed to move to these new premises, it starts on the 1st of June. And William was born on 22 May. So he couldn't be born in that address because the contract did not start until the 1st June. But more important, explains the reasons why they couldn't be there yet on 22 May. And the key thing is to look at the word blanqueado, whitened, because it says that the contract will start on 1st June of this current year and will finish in November, following that inclusive being 3,000 reales per year, in view that the alluded quarter is at the moment being blanqueado, whitened, and therefore the rent is not applicable until the mentioned 1st of the month, when all the keys and the usual frames to open and close windows and doors will be delivered. So they didn't even have the keys, okay? And they didn't even have the keys because they needed to whiten the building. The term whiten alludes to the practice common at the time through the global Hispanic world, and particularly to urban areas such as Madrid, Lima, Seville, Manila, of using quicklime for cleaning walls and ceilings after perhaps suffering humidity or floods, but mainly in the case of epidemics. And the latter scenario is probably the most feasible because Madrid was undergoing a series of epidemics. And under those circumstances, the measure was mandatory under pain of heavy fines and even prison, following a royal decree that since 1751 stated that any suspected case of a contagious illness, which at the time included most illnesses that resulted in intermittent and remittent fevers, had to be reported to the authorities. If the patient died, all his or her possessions had to be burned, regardless of their value, and any affected lodges were to be expected to have the walls brick, plaster, and whitened. And quicklime was preferred over bleach because it was believed to offer the advantages of making the pricking and plaster unnecessary. Foreign visitors, particularly the British, often criticized these measures because they tended to curtail their movements, and they viewed them as draconian. Proprietors also didn't like them because it was an expensive nuisance. But obviously, they have to comply. They had no choice. And these measures remain in place for almost another century, certainly until the middle of the 19th century. And in some way give us a little bit of a hint of the different approach that we can see even perhaps today to pandemics and to epidemics between the Anglo world that seems to be more medicine-based and many more cure-based, and perhaps the Hispanic world that has always tried to take an approach more prophylactic, trying to prevent and try to contain. Now, the Gibbs family did move to the new premises, probably under the terms agreed, although the first document recording clearly the Cantarranas address in the surviving correspondence dates to 14 December 1790. And it is a letter of Dorothea Gibbs to her husband, who was again back on the road because Antony was never too long anywhere. And in the letter, she aimed to transmit the good news about the health of the little Spaniard. And she will be calling William all the time the little Spaniard, because William had been suffering fever. And she's transmitting here with this letter the good news that he has recovered and that he has survived. And indeed, he not only survived this illness, but unlike his parents and siblings who died relatively young, he had a long life, and he died at 85 years of age, which was really a very old age in the 19th century. Now, you remember that I already said that Dorothea had been, badly disposed to the Spaniards. This experience of having her transfer delay and all that, and I've always the experience of having different attitudes towards epidemics, even antagonized her further. So she pushed the family to return to England. And as soon as they returned to England, she refused to return to Madrid at any time. And these have enormous repercussions because, and that's why one of the things I'm saying in the chapter, love is an important determinant. Antony was madly in love with her, and he didn't want to break the family. So this meant that he had to be permanently in the move, that he had to go to Spain all the time and back to England. And this meant that he could not follow the established pattern of the Anglo merchant community, the English, the Scottish, the Irish, that for the most part established themselves in Spain and just kept correspondence and links with the English, Anglo world. He actually had to be physically moving all the time. And that meant also that he had to find a way of controlling the business in Spain while he was in England too, because who was going to take care of the shop in Spain while he was away? And indeed, he had problems with some mates who steal things while he was away. So he had no money to spare in employee salaries and could ill afford to pay other agents' commissions. And also the job of carrying out his work requires self-drive and ready access to capital. So, and they needed to have excellent local connections. Sorry, I see that there's somebody in the lobby. I'm going to stop very quickly to get this person in the lobby, if I can. Okay, there we are. Let's hope I'll continue. Sorry about that. The moment of the problem of doing things habitually. I hope. Are we all right? Yeah. Okay. So now, so we left Antony in the problem of how to run the business, having to move all the time. So there was only a position that he could offer to anybody fitting the description of being able to have access to capital, access to knowledge of good connections locally, having self-drive, and not asking for a salary. And that position was the position of a partner. So he established, and also the English creditors will only allow him to operate through a network of representatives or partners. So that's why he established partners. And he also found another way of doing this because he could establish new companies abroad to operate in a way that from the early 19th century was to be recognized with the term of subsidiary company. So he managed to establish not just a partner, but a subsidiary company. And the benefit of a subsidiary company is that unlike branches, subsidiaries have a separate legal entity from the holding company, even when they may be owned and controlled to a large extent by the holding company. So their obligations are not usually a liability of the parent company. As a result, they can be more easily established and dissolve the company. But so for many years, all the Gibbs houses that they are going to be established all around the world, charge commission to each other as they will be separate entities. Okay. The first person with whom Antony entered into such arrangement was a wealthy fruit exporter in Malaga who had become a close personal friend, Juan Pomar. And I'm telling the story, well, how things go with him. But let's say that there were a few downsides in Antony's unusual pattern of work. Because as I said, he could never stay in one place for too long. So the frenetic lifestyle took an early toll. For instance, in 1793, he had a coach accident and in the outskirts of Seville and left him with wounds. And he had also to deal with the context of the revolutionary wars that added, complexity. But the Peace of Amiens in 1802 placed a promising hiatus in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So he tried to make the most of this period. So he tried to look for assistance. Oh, more people waiting in the lobby. I can't believe this is the most. So, should I get them in or shall I leave them out? I shall leave them out, sorry. So he had to find help. He had no money. He could appoint partners, but now he needed help in the companies that he had already established. So he went and looked home. And so he looked for his own children. So during the Peace of Amiens, he took William and Henry to the continent. And he took them all through France to Spain, and they worked there. And the children were absolutely delighted. But again, when they returned to England, the mother convinced Antony to at least leave William in England. So William could not travel back again to Spain. Having said that, a couple of years later, age 16, William managed to break the maternal clutches and actually went to work in a company of one of his family outside in Bristol, Gibbs, Bright and Gibbs, and that gave him good experience that he's going to use later in Antony Gibbs and Co. Now, the resumption of war in March 1803 placed the business under considerable stress again. And the worst was only averted when in 1805, Antony devised the idea of requesting separate licenses from the British and Spanish authorities to trade throughout the global Hispanic world, particularly with the Viceroyalty of Peru. And you will say, why the Viceroyalty of Peru? Sorry, I jumped too much. This is because, yes, the Viceroyalty of Peru is normally associated with silver and gold, with bullion, but there's another commodity that historians tend to ignore, and that is very important, which is cinchona, quina, also known as quina bark, cascarilla, Peruvian bark, Jesuit bark. And this originates from a large shrub indigenous to South America, mainly to Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And the Viceroyalty of Peru at that time included Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and a portion of Colombia. It was not cultivated elsewhere until late in the 19th century. And since its discovery in the 17th century, the cortez was stripped from the shrub, dry, crushed in small pieces, and turned into various tinctures and tonics for medical purposes. And powdered cinchona bark was used for the treatment of intermittent and remitting fevers. And it's important to realize that in this period, people thought that fever was not a symptom. They considered fever to be an illness in itself. And to this day, in some languages, we say you have to cure the fever. Okay, that's this notion that it was a symptom was alien to them. So that means that cinchona was used in a wide array of illnesses, and of course was the sole agent and remained the sole agent for the treatment and also later on for the prevention of malaria. In 1751, the Spanish monarchy had limited the trade of had regulated the trade of cinchona, and 2 years later established a royal reserve in the Loja region of Ecuador, recognized because it was producing the highest quality. And in this, the cinchona produced in this area operated under what is known as estanco conditions, which is a state monopoly. But that was done in order to distribute it freely to hospitals throughout the Hispanic world, and it was also used by the Spanish monarchy as a tool of diplomacy, namely through gifts and donations to foreign dignitaries. Still, quina, the cinchona, was collected elsewhere in the Andean region in vast quantities and a variety of qualities which were allowed to be traded as any other commodity. Now, I said variety of quality, and that was a big issue. The absence of quality control, incorrect identification, uneven consignments, and even the frequent intervention of smugglers who polluted the product by adding bark of other trees, it started to cast a shadow over the value among health practitioners. But still, because there was no alternative, there was no any other drug to be used, it remained highly prized, and doubly so in times of war and epidemics. So Antony, we return to Antony, he chartered a Spanish frigate, La Hermosa Mexicana, that previously has been known under the Catholic sounding name of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, and got the green line from the Spanish authorities to set sail with goods from Cadiz on consignment to a man, Antonio Varas, in Lima, with liberty to trade also at Veracruz in Mexico and at the Canary Islands, where he was free to collect local commodities and bullion as homeward cargo as well. And on the advice of his brother George in Bristol, who had family interests in the West Indies, Antony decided to remove from the route planned Veracruz to add instead a stop in Jamaica, which offered the opportunity of being furnished with English manufacturers on much better terms than he could get taking them from Cadiz. And such a move was contrary to Spanish rules, but in the Caribbean, it had become common practice. And still, to do that, he needed a British license, because the only way of avoiding at that time to be captured by the Royal Navy with a Spanish ship was having a British license. So he asked his elder brother, Sir Vicary Gibbs, who had been newly knighted and had been newly appointed Solicitor General under the Pitt Ministry, to press the matter with Lord Chamberlain George Leahy, Earl of Armagh, that was the King's Advocate General, who dealt with matters relating to maritime matters, and also with the Privy Council, the Secretaries of State for Foreign Affairs, etc. The thing is that the license was granted, but on the condition that the home cargo had to come to England. So it couldn't go to Cadiz, it had to go to England. Against the background of a failed British invasion of Buenos Aires in June 1806, Antony took a £2,000 insurance to cover the goods from British capture. So he didn't even trust that the British license was going to be useful. And with that in mind, he set, the Hermosa Mexicana set sail from Cadiz on 24 December 1806. And only 2 months passed for the scheme to run into trouble, because Antony received an urgent letter from George Gibbs notifying him that the condition that the ship should dock in England in the way back had rendered actually the whole voyage illegal, because it was in the tooth of the Navigation Acts. After the American Wars of Independence, Britain continued to rely on the Navigation Acts, which were established to boost the income coming from building ships in Britain. So that meant that only goods could come on British ships, and the Hermosa Mexicana was not a British ship. So it had all been a great cock-up, foremost on the part of the government. And Antony was told that everything was going to be done to wave off the consequences of this extraordinary oversight, but again, he didn't trust that that was going to be the case. Moreover, there was a change of government in London, and there were rumors that there was going to be a change of government. He could find himself being fined, and all his consignment, which included cinchona, could be going to be seized by the British. So he looked for alternatives. So he tried to negotiate with the Spaniards, went to Spain, also tried to collect some debts at the same time from the Spaniards. And he arrived, arrived at the same time of a second British invasion of Buenos Aires, which meant that all the British merchants in Spain were being, seen with a lot of suspicion. And eventually he manages to get the goods into Spain. He doesn't take them to England. And the person who resolves all the things is his son, his eldest son, Henry. And as an expression of gratitude, he made Henry, his eldest son, a partner. And now the company is called no longer Antony Gibbs & Co., but now Antony Gibbs & Son in singular. Now, we have, pretty soon after that, we have Bonaparte invading Spain in May 1808. And the whole Gibbs family gets overjoyed when they hear of the Spanish rising against Napoleon. And what they do is to offer the cinchona, all the goods, but including the cinchona, to the first patriot government, known as the Junta Central. And in some way, and this is something that I'm going to be researching even further, this might have been given to the patriots an advantage because the French were desperate to get quinine. They even, when they seized Madrid, they went to the Botica General, which is where the deposit of the cinchona was kept, or the official, the monopoly one, was kept, and they found that they had been burned. So, but this is something I'm still researching. Anyway, Antony instructed Henry to make the most from trade with the Americas, bearing in mind that circumstances had turned them actually the only Protestant house at Cadiz worthy of consideration. And his idea was to keep a paid representative in Cadiz for a couple of years and to have each winter Henry or William visiting Spain. So on hearing that the former employee, William Branscombe, was planning to set up in Cadiz a general commission service, which essentially was setting a competition, what he did was to invite him to become partner of the company. So the company in Cadiz became Antony Gibbs Sons and Branscombe. Now, the Spanish War of Independence, what in the English-speaking world is known as the Peninsular War, brought lots of upheaval, but also provided a turning point towards a period of prosperity for the Gibbs. William Branscombe kept the fort in Cadiz throughout the conflict, supporting the most vulnerable even during the 2.5-year French siege of the town. And although business often seemed a game of snakes and ladders, Antony's debts began to be paid in earnest. They were not paid in earnest until much later. And it started to enjoy the benefits of the Anglo-Spanish alliance because they started to trade without so many restrictions. Crucially, in 1813, William was made partner. So now it's in 1813 where we have finally Antony Gibbs and Sons, which is the name of the company through most of the 19th century, and indeed until early 20th century. And William started to take some of his eldest brother round of trips to Spain, working alongside with Branscombe, seeking clients not just for quinine, but also for cotton and wool manufacturers, and also for planks of iron, sherry, so a variety of commodities. And I'm not going to stop, I'm going to jump a little bit to say that sadly Antony could not enjoy for long this period of opportunities because on December 1815 he had a stroke and he died in London. And he left everything, including his shares in the companies, to his wife, which was something unusual to leave everything to his wife, but with instructions to distribute all equitable among the children after her death. So that also created a sort of situation that I explain in the chapter at home of how to manage the mother. In 1818, as movements for Spanish-American autonomy grew in violent intensity, William set up in Gibraltar a sister business with Jean Lescasson, and to trade directly from Gibraltar to Buenos Aires, Lima, Havana, and also Newfoundland. And keeping an eye on affairs in Cadiz, he also widened the firm's net into the Mediterranean basin through representatives in Nice, that at the time was not part of France, was part of the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. And he had two Spanish exiles in France, One had been exiled for political reasons, who became Gibbs' representative in Marseille, and the other had been one that had got in a legal dispute with the Merchant Guild and Chamber of Commerce in Cadiz, and his name was Nicolas de Pedemonte, and he became the Gibbs representative in Paris. So prospects were looking good to the extent that William considered himself, and he said in a letter, a man of some fortune, a situation that he confessed was rather new to him. But we are now in 1818, so he's already in 1818 a man of fortune. By 1819, the Gibbs had already arrived to the conclusion that all political scenarios, there was a lot of turmoil in South America, but they realized that all political scenarios were to result into free trade in Spanish America. Therefore, appointing a good, trustworthy fellow in Lima was a measure that they would be obliged to take, they said, in order to defend their business, that because they have already secured quite a good business in that part of the world. So William began eyeing some Spanish and English men for that role, but none seemed to entirely fit the bill. And it's in that year, precisely in the summer of 1819, that we have an outbreak of yellow fever in Cadiz, in fact, in all the south of Spain, mainly Andalusia. And William found himself trapped in Cadiz by restrictions in movements placed in an effort to contain it. It was a normal measure that Spaniards used to take, that of quarantining and stop all movement. And among the thousands of fatal victims was Brascombe, okay, the partner, who, considering William not just a partner, but a friend, named William the executor of his will. So he also was busy with that job. The epidemic had broken up among men who had been recruited to participate in an expeditionary force assembled in Cadiz to so-called pacify the rebellious government of Buenos Aires and indeed of the governments of South America, the newly appointed governments. And as a result of this outbreak, not only the expedition was halted, but also triggered a revolution that is known as the liberal, that resulted into the liberal triennium. There was a period of conflicted rule between moderate liberals and exalted liberals under a very unwilling constitutional monarch. Now, William is in Cadiz in the middle of this happening, and at the same time in England, Henry was approached by John Mons. John Mons was the young son of the Dutch consul in Bristol, who had a plan to draw his family's mercantile network to operate through the Pacific and the Far East from a headquarters in Lima. And that plan fired the Gibbs imagination. Due to the distances involved, rather than appointing him as an agent, the brothers decided to establish a subsidiary having Mons as a junior partner, with 25% of the shares and a power of attorney that still conditioned all critical decisions to approval in London. And they gave him precise instructions to get in contact with the new men, I mean, the new rulers in South America. South America is still in the middle of the wars of independence, but they tell them, try to get in contact with the new men to start to trade with these new governments. The Gibbs had already in their book 33 a Spanish peninsular, that means the Spanish born in Europe, and also Spanish American clients in that part of the world who consigned bullion and cinchona and also personal belongings through the company in Cadiz and also the company in London. And in a few cases, they also call on the Gibbs for loans and contracting insurance and the purchase in London of luxury items for private consumption. And there were among them families who supported emancipation in South America, and there were families who were against, who were loyalists. So they had to trade very carefully because they couldn't upset any of their clients. On 5 April 1821, William was visited in Seville, by a group of merchants specialized on the Pacific trade, the so-called limeños sevillanos, who were anxiously seeking to convey their cargo through the constantly changing jurisdictions in South America. And they discovered that placing their property in ships under neutral British flag no longer offered enough protection because the South American, the commander of the newly created Chilean, Peruvian, eventually Navy, Thomas Cochrane, had actually been seizing British ships that were transporting goods to Peru. So in order to avoid that, they have approached William, proposing that their cargo should be labeled as property of Antony Gibbs and Co., so as being British property rather than being a Spanish property, and to have them consigned to London, and having Mons to have it consigned to London rather than to send it to Spain. But William warned them that the British government was unlikely to issue licenses for Spanish manufacturers, even for re-export. So instead, he offered to set an expedition from Gibraltar, keeping the stratagem even hidden to the English ships' captains and crews. So while these initiatives tightened him up in Andalusia, William still found a way of mixing business with the pleasures of Andalusian social life. And in June 1821, he was joined by his younger brother, Joseph, who at the time was looking to step into the business. And a clerk position was eventually found for Joseph in the Cadiz house, and a Spanish master was hired to teach him the rudimentaries of writing commercial letters in Castilian. But in the meantime, and arguing that as Joseph had arrived in the fever months, and that already tells us that people live with this idea of having constant pandemics and that there were periods in the year in which you should perhaps behave differently. Because of that, he sends him to spend some time with an Argentine family in a healthy finca. The family was known as Chavos, in the area that is in the southwest corner of Spain, the area that covers Jerez de la Frontera, San Lucas de Barrameda, and Puerto de Santa Maria. And it was by this means of sending his brother to spend time with this Argentine family that William learned that this Argentine family was trying to set up a similar scheme to the one that he was trying to set up from Gibraltar. And also put him in contact with some key families, merchant families like the Osborne and the Duff Gordon, Anglo-Spanish families, linked with the sherry trade that had themselves lots of good connections. And it was also there where he met the love of his life, and I tell the story because it has all sorts of connotations. I'll tell it in the chapter, but let's go back to the topic of pandemics. Because in the middle of it all, while he's trying to find more connections and more networks in more opportunities in the Mediterranean area, and thinking that things are going to become and be more prosperous having a representative in South America, far from being the herald of opportunities in the Pacific coast, John Mons turned to be a partner of Naimas. It was a disaster. He kept none of the contractual arrangements with the Gibbs, His correspondence with London, Cadiz, and Gibraltar houses were sporadic, and the content was garbled and full of gaps. And he got in trouble with both the new revolutionary men and with the Spanish authorities in the Viceroyalty of Peru. He got himself in jail. And while he was in jail, his clients learned through the newspapers that their consignment had been seized. And among the consignments that disappeared amid it all was a consignment of cinchona bark. And they disappeared in dubious circumstances. And then they started to hear that also that Mons was wanting to become Dutch representative in Lima, which could have been a problem for them because he would have lost the immunity that he had as British citizen. So things became really a nightmare. And this nightmare lasted more or less 5 years. And they had to navigate all this mess during these 5 years. But somehow, because of William's ingenuity, contrary to expectations, the Gibraltar House made record profits in 1824. And they did it mainly through exporting directly to Gibraltar instead of going to Spain itself or indeed to London. And they managed also to get a representative in Rio de Janeiro to travel to Lima to help to clear a little bit the mess of Mons. And the problem of having a partner and not an employee is that they couldn't fire Mons. They had to live with him. So what they did was on 20 June 1825, they sent a nephew of William, Charles Crawley, and they turned him a partner. So the company became Gibbs, Crawley, Mons, and Co. And Mons was given instructions in a long letter, 16-page letter, of what he had to do, but very clear instructions also of where he had to locate himself. And it was to locate himself to reside at Piura, northwest of Lima, near the frontier with present-day Ecuador, for the purposes of collecting barks, that means cinchona, as well as other communities. And the headquarters of the establishment, the headquarters was going to remain in Lima, but they were going to have branches in Guayaquil and in Tacna, also with the idea of facilitating the trade of cinchona. Okay. So why is it that they are so keen in 1825 to get this cinchona? Obviously, there have been already pandemics, epidemics all the time, but why now so much to the point that they want branches open in those places? And indeed also in Valparaiso in Chile, which is also a place where they could land and also get consignments of cinchona coming from Bolivia. This is because in 1820, Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Cabanot isolated the alkaloid quinine, so you didn't need to use anymore the bark, you could turn it into a drug, okay? And purify quinine and other alkaloids, including quinidine, cinchonine, cinchonidine, replace the bark as the standard treatment for malaria eventually, okay, a few years later. And indeed, it still continue to this day being used effectively against chloroquine-resistant Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest of the 4 species of parasites which cause malaria in humans. And in 1825, you remember that they had a Spaniard as representative in Paris. This representative in Paris, Pedemonte, alerts them that there's an opportunity because the manufacturers of quinine were getting all the cinchona that was arriving to France. And that meant that the physicians and people who were preparing nostrums could not get cinchona. So the price of cinchona increased enormously. So that gave a lot of opportunity for the Gibbs to trade there. And a year later, also the Gibbs heard that there was a scarcity in Spain itself. So that also gave them opportunities. And William sees all these opportunities, often dispatching South American cargoes from Gibraltar or via Gibraltar. Supplies were located in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia to be dispatched through intermediary ports in the Pacific coast, which even at the height of the wars of independence were never closed. Agents, as said a moment ago, were appointed to that with a purpose in the ports of Tacna, Arica, and Iquique, the department of Arequipa, and in Valparaiso. And indeed, one file in the archives in 1829 is completely dedicated to our bark, which means the cinchona bark, and it says that this bark was coming from Colombia. So that means that they were using not just the bark coming from Ecuador and from Bolivia, but also from Colombia. Now, political instability, accompanied by trade restrictions in the late 1820s, reduced the activities of the Cadiz house. William took a lot of measures, trying desperately to keep it afloat, even made experimentations involving hiring Spanish botanical experts to ascertain the prospect of cultivating olive trees and origins here in England. Nothing worked. So on April 1827, he has to close the house in Cadiz. So over 30 years of Gibbs' permanent presence in Cadiz came to a close. Now, being light, quina bark offered the advantage that great quantities could be transported alongside cargoes of bullion, for example, or other commodities such as cacao. Now, a short spell of storage in damp conditions was enough to reduce its medical efficacy. So a speedy delivery was of the essence. And that's why when there were all these restrictions, the fact that he could ship them from Gibraltar helped. But as soon as the wars of independence ended and the newly independent, emerging Latin American countries started to function, most of them decided to use the system of free trade. So that meant that they didn't need to go from Gibraltar. You could trade directly from Latin America straight to the continent. So that meant that Gibraltar became a little bit of unnecessary. There was no need to trade anymore through the rock. So in 1833, he stops the operations there and the office closes in 1833. So it means that William doesn't need to go to that part of the world anymore. He can perfectly do everything from an office in London. And there are also emotional reasons why he's doing all that too. But the thing is that his life of trotting around Spain fizzled out. And along with Henry and his cousin George Gibbs in Bristol, he became an investor in the Great Western Railway, and they continued to trade with South America directly, and the profits continued to roll on years and over years, allowing the Gibbs to get to divide around £20,000 a year for the next decade. And £20,000 a year is more or less £3 million of today. Okay. And also there were personal reasons why William is, as from the late 1830s, he decides to stay in England, and it's because he got married and he had 7 children. So that's another reason. But it is only, with all these profits, is only in 1832 when the famous deudas sagradas are fully paid off. And William Wells soared also in that year to colossal levels through a tragedy. His brother Henry died, and before dying, Henry had already inherited the fortune from his own wife. So it means that when he died, William inherited his brother's fortune plus his sister-in-law fortune. And he became also the sole head of Antony Gibbs and Sons. This is 1832. Trade with South America had been increasing steadily in both volume and diversity. Consignments, including copper, tin, and exotic items such as chinchilla and vicuña wool, and of course cinchona, continue coming on. So he was already a rich man, and he was getting richer by the year. So he decided to move house in London. He moves to a place in 13 Hyde Park Street, where he could live with his 7 children. Well, some of his children, not all were born by then. And he decided to look for a place in the countryside. And he had in mind something along the lines of an estate that that his sister had leased in 1828 near Bristol. And it's then when he actually acquires Tyntesfield in 1843. So we can see that by the time that he arrives to buy in Tyntesfield, he had already made a tremendous fortune. And it's also in 1842 when the house in Lima signed a contract by which Antony Gibbs Sons was to provide a loan to the Peruvian estate in exchange for the monopoly control of guano, okay? But the profits from guano do not appear until after 1849, because the guano was not known in Britain. Nobody knew what guano was all about. And the brilliance of William is that he made a campaign of explaining what guano was all about with testimonials from scientists and all that. And so the profits didn't really arrive until 1849. So by then he had already Tyntesfield. So I think it's the moment to arrive to some conclusions. And the most obvious is that Gibbs prosperity resulted for over half a century of building a wide portfolio of mercantile activities. It was not just from the guano and the toads of the bird, the things resulting from the birds. It was from many commodities and also from establishing a network of people that they could trust and that they could rely on. And it was not a single commodity. Definitely was not a single commodity. Not even at the time of guano was a single commodity. But if we have to think of a commodity, cinchona is perhaps the one that we have to say that really determined the shape of their trading practices and even the locations where they will put their houses, and how even determine the way that they will have to operate regarding the time, the seasons, and all that. So that's my conclusion, my main conclusion of the day, that we have to look beyond what is in the balance sheets and try to see a little more to health and emotional aspects when we look to a topic like this one. So I hope I'm not been too long. Probably I have been too long, and I'll cover everything. I'm going to stop now the presentation. I'm sure there are going to be questions. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you. So,
thank you, Graciela. That was fascinating. It's a complex business history.
Yes,
that
yes.
Kind of discovered, and I was going to ask the first question.
Yes.
It's a complex history unfolding against all sorts of international developments, liberation struggles, independence struggles, rather. How did you reconstruct this story? Where are most of the sources? Where did you have to go?
Well, I have to confess something. I met the Gibbs, or William Gibbs, years ago when I was a research assistant in a project about the history of malaria.
Okay.
And I was sent to the National Archives to look for the consignments of quina coming from South America to England. And I always look at the list of merchants, and Gibbs appear all the time. And I didn't know who was Gibbs.
So
Yes,
what
but
records are those? In the
they are the records of the consuls.
Okay.
In the consuls sent the records. The consuls sent records of what they were dispatching from each port.
Okay.
At what time. And this research project covered the whole of the 19th century. So I actually look at the whole of the 19th century, and I could see Gibbs. There were Gibbs, which I had no idea who this Gibbs was. Among other merchants, they were not the only ones, but Gibbs was there all the time. Years pass on, and I go visiting, because I'm a member of the National Trust. I went visiting Tyntesfield, and suddenly I discover this wonderful Victorian house, and I discovered that it has lots of Hispanic connections, and I discovered who Gibbs was.
Right.
So that's when I got in contact with the curator, and I suggested, well, why don't we do something together, and why don't we bring back to life the history of Tyntesfield? And then is when I heard of this story about the fortune of Tyntesfield. I mean, Tyntesfield being built on the basis of the guano, which always ran to me a little peculiar. But, you know, I thought, well, I'm going to see if that's true. And it's only then, when I managed to get the AHRC funding, and I managed to start researching this, that I went to the London Metropolitan Archives, where the Gibbs family papers are. Exactly, yeah. And that's when I found this old material that I've been looking.
And is that a large archive?
It is a very large archive. Yeah. It's really large. I mean, I only look at 10% of what is available. Yes, because it covers the whole Gibbs family from Antony up to the 1980s. Okay. When he becomes HSBC, right. In 1982. So there's a lot to do.
Indeed. Yes. So should we take some more questions from here before we link up with the ones online? So more questions from the floor, yeah.
Thanks a lot for a very interesting paper. And what is very interesting, you develop very well, of course, the whole aspect of the business, and how they manage to make this kind of fortune on medicine somehow. Did you come across any reading or any aspect that was according to, not humanitarian as we think today, but because it's a commodity, as you said, it's a very important commodity, because of course it's for people with malaria as well at the time. But is that just for him and his family, this idea it's a business? Or is there a bit more than just a business? Is there a connection also with the idea that it's a community that is not just to make money, but because also it's perhaps important for the communities and so on? Or do you not see that?
I don't see that coming from the Gibbs. I have to say they don't. They are aware that they need to transport it quickly, because otherwise the effectivity of the bark is lost. But there are no humanitarian angles to this from the Gibbs themselves. I'm not being able to see it, because one of the reasons is that because cinchona was very light, the bark used to be transported with other things. So they will be transporting cinchona and bullion, iron planks, they were just consigning the thing, you see. So they were not just doing cinchona, but obviously they were very aware of the value. Yes.
It's very much, as you said, it's value. It's
that doesn't mean that they were heartless, but let's say that it was not.
It was not a driving.
I could not find anything in the correspondence, at least. So, yes. Yeah.
Sorry, because that was very British.
Yes.
Similarly, the question, was this a good business for the producers of cinchona?
It was indeed a business for the ones who were gathering the cinchona in. Yes, it was, and they have to deal with them too. Okay, yes. Oh yes. Well, it becomes a problem in the late 19th century when the British smuggle the seeds and manage to grow them in Asia. So suddenly you can have now cinchona grown in Asia, and the Latin American cinchona plummeted. It's still being grown today. I mean, the price plummeted because also there was more abundance of it. So the price got reduced, not just for the cinchona in Latin America, it will reduce eventually also for the one produced in Asia. Also, there are other alternative drugs for taking care of fever. Not for malaria. For malaria is still the only thing available in many cases. So it still has value for that particular illness. But the problem is that quinine was essentially, I mean, I'm going to be very, I'm going to generalize here, but it was a little bit like having penicillin, you see, at the time. It was the only thing that was available to take care of most illnesses that have fever. Anything that have fever, you know, you will use quinine. So that's why it was so valuable. Yes.
I got the impression from what you said, understandably, for example, in the case of the French Revolution, that the Gibbses were often reacting to political developments. And I was wondering, particularly in the case of, for example, the British attitude, the British government, like Canning, towards free trade, towards Latin American independence, how much the Gibbs, if any, to any degree, had any input or influence on British policy, on political developments more broadly, that would then affect their business?
Well, they were very keen to have their own business, for instance, so they get involved their relatives who are in government, like in the case of Sir Vicary Gibbs, who is the one who gets them the license. But even that didn't work very well, so perhaps that taught them not to get themselves into politics. But then they don't go around lobbying very much the Gibbs. It's very interesting. I could not find any particularly lobbying on their part. You know, they are very discreet. If they did it, they didn't do it in writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's obviously interesting because, of course, through all the vicissitudes, of course, in the 1820s, I'm guessing business interest fluctuating profitably.
Oh yeah.
Fluctuating.
Oh yeah.
Potentially not influence they might have had.
Well, yes, and also for them, if you think that they were making a lot of profit from deriving things through Gibraltar, when the War of Independence is over and there's no need to use Gibraltar anymore, they lost a little bit of the trade there. They had to adjust. They managed to adjust very well, but it took them a few years. And that was the importance of having good representatives in South America than to guarantee the trade, the flow directly through Britain, because then they will use English ports to send the things to the continent. So, yeah. But they were very discreet. I found the Gibbs, they were, if anything, I think one of the signs of their success is that they don't go around making too much noise. Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming there was no kind of trade organisation or traders organisation that would have spoken for them.
Well, the city of London, and they were members of the city of London. Oh yes, and they were active within the city of London. So everything that they do is through the city of London. Oh yes, oh yes. And that's why we have their archive in the London Metropolitan Archive, because it's the archive of the City of London. Yes. There are some things in the chat. I'm going to be reading them. We have a comment from Tony Pratt, who says, "Thank you, fascinating as an agricultural historian. I still fixate on the bird turds." Okay, that's okay. That's okay. But you have to think also about the things that are grown, and they didn't need the bird turds to grow the cinchona. Hello from Tyntesfield. Ah, Miranda. Miranda is the new curator of Tyntesfield. Hello from Tyntesfield and the National Trust, and many thanks, Graciela, for an absolutely fascinating talk. Great, Miranda. Wonderful. I'm very glad to see that you're here. Where are we? My cursor has gone doolala. Okay. Okay, there we are. Tony Pratt says it's a great house, Tyntesfield, and the gardens are fascinating. I took my garden apprentices there a couple of years ago. All right. Okay. And Diane Baden says, many thanks, Graciela. So Natalia has a question. All right, Natalia, do you want to tell us in person, or would you like to let's see if I can, wait a second that I'm going to get the presentation off so people can see you, hopefully.
Hello.
Oh, no, it's still.
I can just use my voice if you like.
No. Just a second. Just mastering this. That is. How do I finish this? I'm trying to finish the presentation. Okay. It should be there. Nothing. Okay. Take out and take in again. No, it's not. It's refusing to take the screen. It's not projecting it for some reason.
It's okay. I can just ask my question.
Okay, ask your question, Natalia. Yes.
I don't have to be. My face.
Sorry.
It's better if nobody sees my face. In fact, thank you very much, first of all, for this amazing talk. Really fascinating project. That sort of opens up a whole new world of connections, those global connections that are, and I particularly loved how you did it through the prism of one family, a very important family, but my goodness, what a bunch of entrepreneurs. But I was also fascinated, I know you kind of refer us to your chapter a few times about that, and I was wondering if you could maybe say a few words about the women in their lives, because, you know, of course, this commerce, especially the you know, dangerous, risky, lots of money involved, is a very men's world.
Oh, you bet.
It's a very male business, and yet, you know, your chapter has the word love in it as the first kind of word, and clearly these women, various women in their lives, from Dorothea to you mentioned, you know, William married, and that made his plans different, and, you know, changed. So women are important in their lives, but this, you know, this remains a very much a male-dominated world. So how do women, you know, what role do women play, or did play, in this particular family? To what extent they were unusual? Again, you mentioned that the bequesting all of Antony's fortune was unusual, you know, nominating his wife as the sole executive. So perhaps you could just say a little bit about love and women and how they exercise that power, if were they aware of that power? I don't know.
Natalia, I don't know if you could hear. Natalia is asking about the. Yes, it's a problem. Sorry, I have to tell the people here what you said. She's asking what was the role of women, because obviously I did make the point, and I do make the point in the chapter, that women play actually a very important role in shaping also this global entrepreneurship. In ways that perhaps people do not really acknowledge as they should acknowledge. And the first point that we have to say is that the very fact that Antony had to operate with subsidiary companies, that had to be both in London and in Spain all the time, essentially operate like we are operating now in the 21st century, with some problems now that we have COVID, but let's say that they also have these sort of problems, but they didn't have the sort of transport that we have. So imagine the nightmare that was for this man. And this was all because his wife would not accept to move to Madrid permanently. Okay, and she had an enormous power in the family. And the fact that when he dies, he leaves everything to her. And this is already also unusual, even for the time. I mean, men normally did not leave property to their wives. No, I mean, all the property. They will leave probably a portion of the property. But he left everything to his wife. So this tells me about the power of emotions, the power of affections, the power of family dynamics. She obviously must have been a very strong character, but also she obviously has some emotional leverage with him. And not just with him, she tried also to have the leverage with the children. So that's why she didn't allow William to go and be permanently in Madrid as a child. I mean, she allowed him to go and work when he was 16 with a relative in Bristol, but in England, not go away. So she managed to control the situation, and she was a late 18th century, 19th century woman, which in paper you would think had no power at all. And actually, obviously, it's clear that she had a lot of power. And then we can see other women in the family, in the Gibbs, the very fact that not just getting into the family, but even the women who were not able to get into the family, because William had a love affair with a Spanish lady that was the love of his life, and that actually provoked a crisis, a personal crisis, and there's a problem there with religion and religious tolerance, and how far, because the Gibbs boasted themselves to be a tolerant family in terms of religion, but actually they would not accept her because she was Catholic. And they were, they had been originally Presbyterian, but they had become Anglican. And perhaps because of that, they didn't want to have somebody Catholic in the family for fear that this was going to undermine their situation in the city of London, where, you know, you had to be Anglican or from a Protestant background. So even that tells us a little bit, and that meant that he did not marry and have any sort of relationship for almost 20 years after that. He only married in his, I think his 50s or late 40s in 1839, so almost 20 years after he had this love affair. And this love affair also had cultural relations, and you can see it in Tyntesfield. There are echoes of his relationship with this lady, and of his Spanish background in general, like his Spanish experience. So yes, definitely, women had a lot of influence. Yes, yes.
Thank
and
you.
obviously it will have also influence. William decides to stay in England after he marries because he has 7 children, and his wife keeps him also in England. I mean, she doesn't like him to travel much. He manages to go to Spain again, and he returns to Spain again in the 1850s, and he leaves her in France, in the frontier in France with the children, and he goes to Spain, and he goes and meets the lady that was the love of his life in Cadiz. And I tell all that story in the chapter. So there's a lot to say about women, but most definitely they play a very important role in business and in the life of men. Yeah.
Thank you very
much. Thank you. Okay, any more questions?
I'm quite interested in this idea of global entrepreneurship.
Yes.
William Gibbs you present as a global entrepreneur. What do you think were his special qualities that made him a global entrepreneur?
I think the first thing is his duality of identity, because he's a Spaniard of English background. He can manage very well both the Spanish language and culture and the English culture and language. And also the fact that they have an experience of being, of traveling all the time, of movement all the time, of experiencing other cultures, in a moment also of enormous turmoil. So they learn how to change and adapt. And that is a skill and a knowledge that they transmit to his children. So they pass that, and to the company. I mean, they leave that in the company, in the papers. You can see how to behave in a particular context. So that allows perhaps for, and also this system of subsidiary companies protect them in many ways.
It goes wrong sometimes.
If things goes wrong in a subsidiary company, the subsidiary company is the one that is liable, not the mother one. But the problem that it has is that you cannot fire the partner. So that's the problem. So you have to keep on months and add more partners to keep him under control. That's the only problem.
And is he networking all the time in British?
Oh, he's exactly, absolutely. William is all the time in the looking around to see where he can get more opportunities, and networking all the time. And the socialization, what he does when he socializes, obviously he also enjoys Andalusian life and English life. I mean, he obviously likes it. He's a guy who had a great, very good musical ear. So for instance, to this love of his life, he gives her, I think it's a piano, an organ and a piano as a gift. And they enjoy music. I mean, he had a real sense of joie de vivre. You know, he knew how to enjoy life, And that in some way meant also that he had the possibility of socializing with people that in the future will be useful for his business.
And how often did he engage to deliver board making?
Well, yeah.
Was there a lot of that? Was there a lot of bribes?
There was a lot of bending the rules without breaking them. So they will do as much as they could before falling into complete illegality.
Okay.
But yes, there was a lot of bending. But there were very peculiar circumstances too, and very few people actually survived. When they said in the 1810s that they were the only Protestant house in Cadiz worthy of name, that was true. The others have gone all down the drain. So, yeah, good. Right. So
any questions in the room or on the screen?
I cannot see any in the screen at the moment. Hello from Tyntesfield volunteers. We look forward to seeing you soon. Many strong women in the Gibbs Sons. Absolutely. Fantastic, Maggie. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Right.
Okay, perhaps we can draw a conclusion then. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye. Bye-bye. And we have something coming up in December, don't we?
December the 8th, we have online talk from Japan on the British garrison in Yokohama in the late 19th century.
Yes, it's Thomas French from the University of
Mitsumeikan.
Okay, in Japan.
Yeah,
he's going to be talking to us from Japan.
He did his PhD here with me, so it's actually really it's brilliant that he's giving us this talk.
Okay. Right. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care. I'll stop the recording. If I can. The cursor disappears from time to time, so. Okay. Where are we? I think.